Hello, Microsoft Build audience, and welcome to today's session. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are around the world. And welcome to our Ask the Expert session, Build Secure B2C Applications with Azure AD External Identities. We have a really great panel of folks to answer your questions today. Please use the chat to answer your questions. After your questions are approved, they will appear in the chat window, and you can upvote your favorite questions by giving them a thumbs up. Our on-camera experts will be able to take a handful of the most popular questions, and we'll do the best we can to answer the rest of your questions via the chat. Please be respectful during today's session and be aware that it may be recorded, and please adhere to the Microsoft Code of Conduct for our digital events. My name is Adam Stoffel. I'll be your moderator today. I'm a senior program manager with the Microsoft Identity Customer Experience team, and I have a group of my very esteemed colleagues, Krister, Vinu, and Gayan, who will be helping me answer some questions on camera for you today. I would like to start out with a question that it looks like we've gotten in the chat already, and I want to ask Gayan this question. Gayan, can you tell us a little bit about how to take advantage of identity protection for B2C, how you can turn it on and how you can make the most out of it?
Sure, thank you, Adam. So identity protection, we take a layered approach for security. So there's identity protection that protects you from things like brute force password attacks that's already there. On top of it, we have a signaling mechanism which you could use inside user flows and in advanced policies to take an action. So the authentication process will generate a signal about the level of risk, and then based on that signal you can take an adaptive action, for example to reject it or to elevate it using MFA and so forth. We have a link that we'll share with you on how to implement that.
Great, thanks, Gayan. Our next question, Vinu, I might ask if you can take this one. The question is, what plans do we have going forward to update or improve the development experience for Azure AD B2C?
Yeah, it's a great question, Adam. Thank you for that. As a lot of you might have heard, we are converging the B2C, platform with the Azure AD, and a lot of the B2C features would start appearing on the Azure AD and vice versa. So a part of that is also to make, changes and make sure that the development experience for B2C policies is very easy, and all of the custom policy work that you do appears in the user flow. So that's definitely on the roadmap.
Great, thanks, Vinu. Krister, I see that there's a question about data residency and managing GDPR considerations. Is that something you could tell us a little bit more about?
Yes, thank you, Adam. Data residency, when you create a B2C tenant, you pick your country, which maps to region, and that currently maps to the US, Europe, Asia Pacific, or Australia that we have in preview, which means that we map you to the closest data center that we have, and your data is stored in that region. So I live in Europe. If I pick a country in Europe, I know that my data will be stored in, let's say, the West Europe data centers, etc., and I can rest assured that it's not going to leave it. When it comes to GDPR, B2C is a solution that it will not sort of be the magic cure that will make you all of a sudden GDPR compliant, and it won't break you either. You have to do your part, and B2C will help you to do the rest. We do have features like the right to be forgotten, where you can delete yourself as a user from the service that you're using. We do have the feature like profile edit, which helps you to create a feature like right to access to see what type of data the service is storing about you. And we do have other features like parental consent for age gating, etc. So B2C is a solution that can help you be GDPR compliant.
Thanks, Krister. Gayan, here's another great question. The question is, what best practices are there for handling roles in B2C? Can these be implemented and added to the token like they can be with B2B collaboration in Azure AD?
Yeah, sure. That's a great question. the answer is it depending on what you're trying to do. The answer is yes and or maybe no. If you're trying to deal with few roles, those are administrative. You can use the built-in roles that's in Azure AD, and those roles will be emitted in the token. If these are line of business application specific roles, there are multiple ways of doing it. The recommended way is to store these roles externally to B2C, and then at the runtime, make a REST API call to obtain those roles and then make them part of claims that you can emit as part of the claim. Now, if you don't have many applications, you could also store that information inside the directory under the user as an attribute or as a group membership, and then they can emit it as part of a claim inside the token.
Excellent, great information. Vinu, I have a question for you. The question is, can we use custom domains for authentication flows in B2C rather than using b2clogin.com?
Yeah, absolutely. So we, in fact, went public preview on custom domains using Azure Front Door in April. So what that means is you can use Azure Front Door to enable custom domains in your login pages. So you can absolutely do that. And some of the additional benefits of using Azure Front Door is that the Azure Front Door also has WAF configurations that you can enable, or you can bring in your own Azure, web application firewalls, and you can integrate that as well. So if you've not tried it yet, please do give it a shot.
Thanks, Vinu. Krister, I'm going to give you an interesting question that I just saw in the chat. The question is about identity proofing and verifiable credentials, and asking about what's the difference between identity proofing and VCs, and when would you use one versus the other?
Ooh, what is the difference between identity proofing and VCs? Let's hope I understand the question correct. If not, please sort of continue the question in the chat. VCs, or verifiable credentials, which is the preview that we launched in April, it is based on W3C and DIF, the Open Standards body, and it's a way for you to take control of your identity and carry it around in a wallet. In our case, the Microsoft Authenticator. The difference between that and B2C is that B2C is an identity provider. I use it to sign in, to give my credentials in whatever shape or form that might be, to access the web app or the online service or the smartphone app. If I use verifiable credentials, it could be a combination. I could, in the future, present my verifiable credentials to an application that is backed by B2C, and in combination do an authentication and get access to the application in a certain way. So the difference is, I would say, the mobility part, where I carry around my identity in my authenticator in the decentralized identity solution, or B2C, which is an identity as a service, and in our case, a cloud service. Adam, you are on mute.
Thank you for calling that out for me. Thanks for the info on verifiable credentials. That's a really interesting new technology that we're working with. Vinu, here's another interesting question. So the question is about the difference between Azure AD B2B and B2C, and what some of our future plans are for the services. When might you use one versus the other, and where are we going with that? Okay, yeah, great question. So, as it stands now, in the B2C is a different product than B2B. And from a user perspective, of course, when you're talking about B2B, you have partnerships between your company and another company. Maybe you want to collaborate with them. You might want to use governance, PIM access and things like that. So that is from a user perspective. That is B2B. And when you're talking about B2C, it's your
customers, your consumer applications, say maybe you have a grocery store and you have your end consumers logging onto your application to order groceries home. So that is the difference from a user perspective. From a tech perspective, B2C tokens are not accepted by any of the Office 365 apps. So which means that you cannot use a B2C token, and that won't be accepted by maybe Power BI or SharePoint and things like that. So that could be one big differentiator that you could use to choose between a B2B or a B2C product or identity platform. So that is where we stand now. But in future, as a part of external identities, we are definitely converging the platforms, and we do understand the it's a very thin line between how you differentiate a B2B user and a B2C user. So we are merging the platforms, and you would be able to make use of features that's existing both in Azure AD and B2C all in one place.
Thanks, Vinu. There's a question in the chat asking about some strategies for making Azure AD B2C more highly available and resilient. Gayan, can you share some ideas with us?
Okay, coming out of mute. Yes, certainly. Thank you. Yes, so there are multiple ways as an application owner that you can make that application highly reliable. We documented some of that information in a document called Build Resilience in Your Customer Identity and Access Management with B2C. We'll be sharing that link here. But at very high level, it's multiple layers. To start with, how you manage the token lifetimes. And to go beyond the standard token lifetime of one hour and to extend that over a period of time if you can, if your compliance and security frameworks allow you to do that based on the industry. The second thing that you can do inside the application in the application pipeline is if you have, for example, an API manager or APIs to increase the caching of the payloads so that if the same request is being made multiple times by a certain client or multiple clients, you can just provide that information. Making the applications to be fault tolerance or to gracefully fail if a certain part of an behavior or functionality is down is another best practice that you can implement. The key piece that what we learned from some of the recent outages is the customers who had implemented things like synthetic transactions that monitored any kind of failure that's going on and got proactively notified were able to actually put mitigations in place. For example, if their API is down, they were able to put in or deploy additional APIs, or even to put a banner saying, hey, the service is temporarily unavailable, so that the customers are appropriately notified. So please take a minute to look at the documentation that we are sharing, and that has more detailed, implementable, kind of prescriptive information. Thanks.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Gayan. Krister, I see that there's a few questions in the chat asking about different things related to automation. So there's one question about what tools are available to, for example, migrate between one B2C tenant and another B2C tenant. And there's also some questions about integrating with DevOps. Can you tell us a little bit about the options and the experiences there?
Yes, thank you, Adam. I'll do my best. First, if we take the DevOps question first, when you want to automate the deployment of especially custom policies, you can do that in DevOps. It's a matter of do the editing of the policies, changing your tenant to whatever tenant name you have, updating the GUIDs and the app IDs for the identity experience framework and the proxy app, etc. Then to actually do the uploading, Graph API supports that. So you can automate that and upload custom policies, etc. in your DevOps pipeline. We have a document article about that where you get an access token with client credentials to your tenant, and then you use the Graph API to upload it. When it comes to user flows, certain things cannot be fully automated, so you need to use the portal in that aspect. Migration touches on the subject of DevOps. Migration usually means migrating users and the user attributes. And again, that is done via Graph API, where we can create user objects and import attributes. We usually talk about this, that you do that in a pre-migrate fashion or a seamless fashion, where the pre-migrate fashion means that you have all the data at hand and you can pre-create the users even with the passwords, etc., so that when the next day comes, users can log in, etc. The seamless scenario means that we have most of the data, but we don't know the password of the user, luckily. So when the user signs in the next time, we need some help, either from the old identity provider or some storage where we can have an encrypted hash of the password, etc. So we can get help from that functionality or the old identity provider to do the first login. But the key to this is really the Graph API that helps you do the read and write and query of user objects.
Yeah, thanks, Krister. Vinu, a question that is popping up is about what are some of the options for customizing the MFA experience in B2C?
Yeah, so if I understand, so let me speak from it from two different perspectives. When we say customizing an MFA, one could be, customizing when the MFA pops up. So that can absolutely be done with the custom policies. You have fine granular control of when you can, prompt for an MFA from the user, based on, certain, conditions and things like that. So you can definitely do that. And the other aspect is customizing the MFA itself. Out of the box in B2C, we have phone-based SMS and call as MFA providers. But we can also integrate with a number of other third-party MFA providers like Authy app and maybe Google Authenticator and things like that. So we'll put in a link where you can see those samples. And also Microsoft Authenticator TOTP is on private preview. So that is something that will be going a public preview soon. Thank you.
Thanks, Vinu. There's a question about the concept of a universal directory and options for provisioning accounts into and out of Azure AD B2C. Diane, can you give us a little bit more information on that?
Sure. Would love to. So there are multiple options that's available. You can pre-create the accounts. You can migrate the users just in time when the user is signing in for the first time. The approaches that you should consider depends on the requirement that you have. For example, if you have very good quality data and you know that at runtime the quality of data is not going to impact just-in-time user creation, then you can just migrate the user just in time. However, if you want to make sure that I can actually migrate this data when the user is getting created and pre-provision them, make sure the key values are migrated to the other system, then it's better to do a sync process where you are creating these users in the other system. Now, one disadvantage in pre-creating the users or trying to get into a sync situation is you don't want to get into a two-way sync solution, or you don't want to build something to do a two-way sync if your number of users are extremely high, because most likely if you have millions and millions of users, you will never get into a fully consistent state between these two. Right, so you'll have to build something that is event-driven. We support this using custom policies, where every time a user updates, you can make a REST API call to other system and then make the change on the other side. So you need to make sure the other system can do onto the B2C side as well, if you're trying to build something like that. The third thing to consider is, do you want to keep the legacy system for long term? So if you're migrating, sometimes you may coming from a competitive platform, or you're trying to get rid of an on-prem system that you want to wipe out. So if that is the case, to decommission, if that is the case, then you can migrate those users, pre-migrate these users, and implement like a strangler pattern to migrate the credentials just in time. So I think the most commonly used method is you pre-provision the users into B2C minus the credentials, and then you migrate the credentials just in time when the users are trying to sign in by verifying the credentials against the legacy system. Adam?
Thank you, Gayan. Krister, can you tell us a little bit more about what options there are for machine-to-machine authentication flows in relation to Azure AD B2C?
Yes, thank you, Adam. B2C is mostly an identity provider where physical users sign in and sit behind a browser or use a device like a smartphone. So when it comes to machine, the way you interact with B2C becomes a little bit different. We have customers who uses client credential in order to get access tokens, but keep in mind then that client credentials isn't a flow that you can invoke a custom policy on. So you can only get an access token from the underlying B2C tenant, which means that you're sort of limited in if you want to do something constructive with the identity experience framework. But in scenarios where customers really need that, we see them doing that. I've also seen a couple of odd cases where they try to make custom policies non-interactive, but I wouldn't recommend that because that is really complex. Making sure that you succeed. So I would say client credentials is your best option now, and I think Kelvin answered the question previously here that we are looking into making client credentials available in Identity Experience Framework too.
Thank you, Krister. Vinu, could you tell us a little bit more about how we can use Azure AD and Azure AD B2C in the same app together?
Yeah, for sure. Actually, we do have a demo that does exactly that, and I can pop in a link for that. So you can use B2B and B2C as login for the same app, but you would have to register that app at two different places, both in B2B and B2C, so that the respective identity providers knows this is the client and where the tokens need to be sent. But from an experience point of view, it's the same app and they can log in with both B2B and B2C. And the other experience that you could also do is in B2C, you can federate with Azure AD, which is sort of technically another B2B provider. So with both of those, you should be able to achieve what you want.
Thanks, Vinu. Gayan, this might be a little bit of a follow-up question kind of to your last question that you answered, and it's about membership information which is stored in an on-premises database. How can we tie that to Microsoft Identity, to B2C Identity? Do you need to move the user database into Azure?
Yeah, that's a very good question. You don't, technically you don't, as long as your on-prem identity is accessible via an API. So you can do like an API facade or some kind of pattern where you have an API, a RESTful API that you can access your on-prem data store. And B2C has the ability to make a REST API call to an external system at the authentication time, either to validate the credentials or to obtain additional information about the user, like attributes that can be used to augment the claims sent back. So you don't have to migrate the user database on to Azure, but if you can, as a cloud platform, that would be a better option because the data will be on the cloud. You have more high availability options that you can implement, but it's not a requirement.
Thanks, Gayan. Krister, I think I actually also have another follow-up question for you. And this is related to data residency and compliance. The question is regards to high availability within a particular region. Are there multiple data centers where data is stored in B2C in the different regions, and how does that provide high availability?
Yes, if you look at, thank you for the question, good question. If you look into the persistence layer, you can look into the architecture docs of Azure AD and see the architecture where we have read and write replicas, and we have failover, so that you can rest assured that we're not gonna come to a halt just because we have an issue in one data center. This is distributed across multiple data centers within one region, and the same goes for the policy engine, the execution of user flows or custom policies, which is distributed across multiple data centers within the region. So it is highly available, and it will not come to a halt just because you have an issue in a single data center.
Great. I know that our engineering teams do a lot of great work to ensure the high availability of the service. Vinu, there's a question about whether it's recommended to use OpenID Connect or SAML with B2C. Can you provide some insight?
Yeah, so B2C does support both, OIDC and SAML. So customers typically tend to use SAML only for legacy applications. Maybe those applications do not accept the JOT tokens or the OpenID Connect and OAuth tokens. So that's the reason they use SAML. But all of if it's a greenfield application and native apps, all of those apps, absolutely, go the OpenID Connect route. So if you are able to, we'd recommend that you go the OIDC route.
Thanks very much, Vinu. Gayan, there's a question about how you can use Azure AD B2C for APIs in addition to user authentication. Can you explain how that works?
Yeah, I think it has multiple parts into that question. We actually had a video that we published on YouTube talking into more detail about the patterns that you can use. If an application is trying to make a call to an API, the application can use the client credentials flow, not using the B2C policies, but using the Azure AD capabilities of the client credential at this point. Like Pawan mentioned, this is something that we hear from other customers, that we are looking at the possibilities of implementing the client credential flow for B2C. But today, your option is to use a client credentials for in Azure AD, so that your API manager or the API will have to validate the tokens issued from Azure AD instead of B2C. In addition to that question, where a service is trying to call an API, if an application is going to call an API for a user in front of it, it's just the standard OAuth flow. So there's quite a lot of documentation we made available where you can call, you can create scopes for the API functionality, and then grant permissions for the client application to access those APIs. I hope that I answered the question. I think that was a pretty loaded question. We will publish the link to the video so you can have a look at and understand it a little better.
Great. Thanks, Gayan. Vinu, I'm going to go back to you because I actually see a couple of protocol-related questions, and since you just answered our question about OpenID Connect and SAML, I thought maybe I could ask you those. So the first question is about JOT tokens, JWT tokens, and how they're validated and where to find the signing keys for those. And then the second question, and I can ask you this again after if you need to, is about single log out and how single log out works.
Sure. Yeah, so for the first question, typically, how you would validate, the token, including the signature, is that, you'd have, an authentication authorization library, something like MSAL, and that will do the work for you. The library would, validate these tokens. So as a part of the validation of the token, it will also validate the signature. And where you would, get the public key for this validation is that B2C or any identity provider will publish a metadata. And that metadata will have, a link to the public key wherein with which the library will validate the token. So that's the first question. Answer to the first question, and the second one was how you implement a single logout. Adam, can you repeat that one more?
Yes, exactly. How does single logout work?
Yeah, so we do have, B2C does, publish an endpoint, for logout. So essentially, your app would call that, endpoint, and when it does, the sessions are basically cleared. Once the logout is being invoked, when the user logs out of one application, even if you have single sign-on enabled between multiple apps, all of those sessions are revoked, and the user would have to log in, to the single signed-on application as well.
Yeah, thank you, Vinu, for answering both of those questions. Krister, I'll go to you for the next question, which is about single sign-on. Could you give us a little bit of information about how single sign-on works in Azure AD B2C across multiple applications, and what options there are for configuring session behavior?
Yes, thank you, Adam. Single sign-on in B2C is controlled via a session cookie. So when you have signed in, the B2C gives the device or the application a cookie, be it the browser or the phone. You can control in B2C how that cookie, the SSO cookie, should be emitted. You can say that it should be tenant-wide, it should be application-wide, or it should be sort of policy-wide. That means that the default is the tenant. And if I ever go back to the same B2C instance again, a browser will pass this cookie to that host name, and B2C will see that, wait a minute, you do have a session going, so I'm not going to ask you for credentials again unless we do step up with MFA, etc. If I set that the SSO should be on the application level, same thing applies, but it needs to be within the same client ID if it's an OpenID. And the most sort of restrictive one is, doesn't matter if it's the same application, it has to be within the same policy. So if I happen to go to password reset or profile edit or just some other policy, if I do have an SSO session, that will not help me because the SSO cookie is not intended for that policy. Most common is that you do it for the tenant because that is what the users expect. Then in B2C, you can configure lifetimes, etc., and what should happen, how long-lived the sessions should be. Also important thing is the keep me signed in. If you should have an expiry date, so it should survive when I close the browser and I open it after lunch, etc., and I have SSO at that time too. So that is how SSO works with B2C.
Thanks very much, Krister. Well, folks, that's all the time that we have today. Thank you all for submitting your questions. There were a lot of really great and interesting questions that came through in the chat. Thanks also to our on-screen speakers, to Krister, Vinu, and Gayan. And a big thanks to everyone who is helping us answer your questions in chat, Arthi, Ed, Kelvin, Pawan, and Stephanie. With that, we're going to close out today's session. You should see some links on your screen for some additional information about external identities and about Azure AD B2C. Thank you, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your Build conference.